From the chaos of a post-9/11 city grappling with invisible threats sent through the mail, to the chilling discovery of a hidden poison, and a relentless hunt for an unseen serial killer moving through communities. This isn't just about microbes and molecules. It's about the human stories caught in the crosshairs, and the extraordinary individuals working quietly behind the scenes to protect us. From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and what you'll hear is a conversation between LaShawn and Dr. Don Weiss, a veteran disease detective who's seen it all. They explore how science has evolved, why some mysteries remain unsolved, and the surprising challenges that public health faces, even with life-saving answers in hand. You'll join the point in the conversation where they explore the gritty realities behind the headlines, the painstaking process of connecting the dots that others may have missed, the split-second decision-making that can save lives, and the frustrating battles against both invisible pathogens and visible political interference. They start off with the Anthrax attacks. You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
So, October 2001, weeks after 9/11, you're suddenly dealing with this weaponized anthrax sent through mail. Obviously, a super complicated one with multiple layers. Can you kind of go through some of the main points there, and how did existing surveillance systems handle this or fail to handle this in detecting this kind of attack?
Sure. So immediately after 9/11, we started to put together something called syndromic surveillance. What happens with inhalational anthrax, that was what the greatest concern was, is it has a biphasic, sometimes has a biphasic illness, whereas you have flu-like symptoms for a couple of days, may have a little pause in between, may not. And then you get what's called mediastinal pneumonitis, which is a really bad pneumonia and hemorrhagic infection, blood in your chest cavity. And then once you get to that point, death is nearly universal. So we came up, it wasn't just us, this has been something that's been talked about for 10 years or so, but we developed a system for New York City where we would do surveillance for that prodromal illness by getting data from emergency departments. Up to that point, emergency departments did not report anything. So we put together a bunch of different syndromes like gastrointestinal, flu-like illness, fever, cough, and we collected data from what would be called the chief complaint. So if you go to the emergency department, say, here, I'm not feeling well, I'm coming to see the doctor, the nurse or whoever doing triage will ask you, well, what's your chief complaint?
Right.
And they try to distill it down to the simplest possible, cough or fever. Very often it was, I'm not feeling well.
Right.
And we would scan that. We'd use statistical space-time statistics to see whether or not there were clusters occurring in a syndrome, in an age group, in a part of the city. So we started doing that. We pretty much had that implemented within a couple of days after 9/11.
Wow.
What Dr. Weiss is describing here is a critical flaw in emergency preparedness. We often prepare for the threats we expect, not the ones that actually materialize. The 2001 anthrax attacks began in mid-September with letters containing weaponized anthrax spores mailed to news media offices and 2 Democratic senators. Public health officials were scanning for inhalation anthrax, the kind that kills quickly and spreads through the air. But the first cases they saw were cutaneous anthrax, skin infections that look more like spider bites than biological terrorism. This disconnect between expectation and reality would prove deadly. 2 postal workers at the Brentwood facility in Washington, D.C., Thomas Morris Jr. and Joseph Kersine, died from inhalation anthrax on October 21st and October 22nd, 2001. They were handling the mail that had been cross-contaminated by the anthrax letters, but initial symptoms can often mimic the flu, leading to delayed treatment.
And again, the key point, because it gets back to your question about what was the failure of surveillance, We were looking for inhalational anthrax, a weaponized anthrax that would cause inhalational pneumonitis disease.
Right.
And weeks went by, we didn't see anything like that. But we were hearing about people that were showing with strange rashes on their finger, the chest wall, their cheek, a baby who had it on his elbow. And we weren't really thinking about cutaneous anthrax, which is another form of it. And it wasn't until late mid-September that we finally, well, it was mid-September, we finally made the diagnosis of cutaneous anthrax. And then things really accelerated when that photo editor down in Florida, it was October 4th, I think it was diagnosed with inhalational anthrax. It was initially stated that he got it from camping or being out in the woods. That was totally ridiculous.
Right.
That was something that the Trump administration put forth. And then cases started showing up elsewhere in postal workers.
Wow. Wow, yeah, that's very interesting. And we've been talking a lot about, and I guess typically in public health, we talk about non-communicable diseases and infectious diseases and bacterial-based origin or viral-based origins. However, in the book, I remember reading bits about thallium and the poisoning pieces that come with more chemical pieces that we might not talk about as much in public health. When you think about detection and epidemiology, my mind goes to infectious diseases, like some of the ones that we've already mentioned. Can you tell us a bit more about this thallium situation?
Sure. Very sad situation. That's another thing that's a feature of the book. Not only is it about the people who did public health, my colleagues, it's about the people that were affected by the diseases. There were a number that were really very touching, and this was one of them. So we had developed over the years with anthrax, with Ebola, with meningococcal disease, a very close relationship with the Office of the City Medical Examiner.
Right.
And there was one particular medical examiner there whose husband actually worked at the health department, who was my contact there. And she called me one day and said, listen, I need your help. It's about a 3.5-year-old child who died, and we're thinking he may have died of an infectious cause. We're thinking he may have died of encephalitis. She sent me the chart, I reviewed it, and immediately there were some things that just weren't clicking, weren't right with me. The first thing was that the child had an x-ray of the chest because he was having respiratory difficulty and had a respiratory collapse.
Yeah.
And what that x-ray caught was the top part of his abdomen. And there was some material in his stomach that was radio-opaque. Radio-opaque means normally when x-rays go through tissue, if there's air there, it's black.
Yeah.
And normally most of what would be in the stomach would be black. What was there was white. So you're probably familiar about, people talked about getting barium swallows.
Yeah.
That's a study to examine the esophagus and the stomach. You swallow barium, which is radio-opaque, shows up white. So the question was, why did this 3.5-year-old child have something radio-opaque in his stomach?
Right.
The second thing that was unusual about that case is he had a wound in his thigh. And there was no explanation for that. The parents didn't see a wound. There was no wound reported. And so when that was x-rayed too, there was something radio-opaque in the wound. So that caused the medical examiner to then send tests out for toxicology. And it took a while, it took several months, but eventually it came back very high levels of thallium. Thallium's a metal.
Wow.
It used to be used in rat poison. It's been banned in this country. It's highly toxic, and somebody murdered that child. Once it was started to look at that there was foul play, it was uncovered that the child's grandmother had died just a few months earlier.
Wow.
And she died of something. She was older. They thought it was cardiac or stroke related, but when her body then was exhumed, and she also died of thallium poisoning.
Wow.
A child's death can often trigger questions of infectious origin, but sometimes the most critical clues defy conventional medical explanation. What started as a suspected case of encephalitis quickly morphed into a chemical poisoning investigation due to a few critical overlooked details. The most alarming clue? The child's x-ray. It revealed a radio-opaque material in his stomach, appearing bright white where it should be dark. An unexplained wound on his thigh showed the same radio-opaque material, suggesting an injection site. Toxicology tests would later confirm extremely high levels of thallium, an odorless, tasteless metal banned for commercial use in the US since 1975 due to its toxicity. The investigation took a chilling turn when the child's grandmother's body was exhumed, revealing similar levels of thallium that were deemed lethal. A suspected double homicide, hiding behind what initially appeared to be natural deaths.
It's a crazy city, New York. We had fish toxicity. We had all sorts of infections. There was the mummy that was found in Queens.
Wow.
You know, it was an exciting time to work there, even though it was nerve-wracking. I had a full head of hair when I started.
I want to take us back to another case because these are such fascinating cases, and of course you explain and go into a lot more detail in the book, so definitely want to point that out to some of our listeners to check it out and go get the book. But you often liken epidemiologists as disease detectives, and we mentioned it a couple times now, and you did make the analogy with me today about it's almost like criminal detectives, right? And you do mention that this analogy comes to life as you hunted for what you called a serial killer in 2005. Can you tell us more about this pathogen that was hiding in the shadows of central Brooklyn? And what kind of made this outbreak different than some of the historical patterns?
Sure. So that gets back to a disease I mentioned a little while ago, meningococcal disease. The bacteria is called Neisseria meningitidis. It's a gram-negative bacteria. It causes blood poisoning and meningitis, both of those. It turns out that blood poisoning is much more serious than the meningitis part.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that common in New York City. It's like 1 in a million or less than that now, but it's extremely fatal.
Right.
As far as communicable diseases concerned that we were dealing with, most of them were way less than 1%. Meningococcal disease is somewhere between 10 and 15%. And you're familiar with that expression, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon?
No, I'm not.
Well, it's an American expression. So Kevin Bacon is an actor, and he was in a lot of films. And there was this game that people play that they connect 2 actors together to Kevin Bacon, so that eventually, if you went back at least 6 degrees, you'd find 2 people that had been in a movie with Kevin Bacon.
Neisseria meningitidis, the bacterium behind meningococcal disease, earns its serial killer nickname with a fatality rate of 10 to 15%, significantly higher than most infectious diseases. While most people who encounter it become asymptomatic carriers, harboring the bacterium in their throat without getting sick, they can still transmit it to others. This elusive carrier state makes tracking transmission incredibly difficult. The 2005 to 2006 outbreaks in central Brooklyn was highly unusual. Instead of the typical mix of bacteria types, cases were primarily Group C and clustered around recreational drug use. A targeted vaccination campaign in 2006 helped to bring the outbreak under control, but the chameleon-like bacterium reappeared. The same strain reemerged in 2011 to 2013, this time affecting men who have sex with men in community, highlighting the pathogen's remarkable ability to find new niches within social networks.
So meningococcal is like that. It's dangerous to people immediately around it, but what happens is it gets transmitted from person to person to person, and in that chain, those people are not getting sick. They're carriers. They have it in the back of their throat for a couple weeks at a time. They get rid of it, they're well. So you may end up with 2 people separated in space and time by quite a bit, months, weeks, distance, that have the exact same strain because it got passed, especially in a place like New York where you have 8-some-odd million people in close proximity to each other. So this was a disease we were tracking. It does cause outbreaks. Generally, there have been outbreaks at universities, in campuses, closed barracks, high schools, things like that where it's a closed community. And certainly it was a disease I was well familiar with. My grandfather died of meningococcal disease. So it was something that we were always on the lookout for.
Right.
And back in 2005, we started seeing these cases cropping up in Brooklyn. And there's different group types of it. There's A, B, C, and the one Y, W. The one that we had mostly here in New York City was C and Y, and this was C. And generally, there was a mix in any given year. There's a mix of the most common types, but these were all coming up C. So that was the first clue.
Right.
And then the second clue is, as our investigators were asking, is a lot of these people had the history of drug use, either current drug use, past drug use, or they lived with a current or past drug user, they were on methadone treatment. And that was the clue that we started to hone in on. And eventually it took us putting out a vaccination campaign to get the outbreak to stop in 2006.
Yeah, and what was the role of some of those frontline workers like in that campaign? Did they play a pivotal role in that?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, the public health nurses are the ones that investigate meningococcal disease. So they were, one, making sure that we got samples to the lab. Number two, they were interviewing the patient if they were able to be interviewed, or the next of kin. One of our investigators, Paula, who's mentioned throughout the book, her husband was a police detective, and she was pretty much a police detective herself.
Yeah.
She would get cell phone records. She would speak to all sorts of families, because what we needed to do quickly was identify who those close contacts were and get them antibiotics to stop spread. If that doesn't work, which it didn't, because it wasn't the people closest getting sick, it was people extended out that were seemingly unconnected but were in the same community. That's when we had to go to a vaccine campaign.
Wow. Yeah, I could see why this was a very complex serial killer. So,
and it came back in 2011 to 2013. The same strain. That time it wasn't in drug users, it was in the MSM community.
Okay, wow. Yeah. And I guess now that you've highlighted many of these different outbreaks, these diseases, potential chemical contamination and poisoning, and your overall kind of just experience in this field, has your approach essentially changed throughout or evolved throughout these 2 decades in handling these investigations?
Well, I think that the basic tenets of investigation, that one, you're confirming it, you're getting your team together, you're collecting the data, whether it's physician interviews, patient interviews, chart reviews, that pretty much has stayed the same. That hasn't changed. I think what really has changed is the advances in laboratory methods.
Right.
Back when I first started at the health department, we really had no good way to compare two isolates.
Right.
I mean, we were using a system that was like a basic description of a criminal, that they were 6 foot, they were wearing a hat, a sweatshirt, and red sneakers. That could describe a lot of people.
Right.
And then as the laboratory science got better and DNA technology got better, we got to say, it was almost like fingerprinting then, where you could take the bacteria and say, aha, this one is the same bacteria as that one. That's called whole genome sequencing.
Right.
So that was the main thing that changed during that time period.
Right, right. And through all the cases and stories that you mentioned, are there any particular ones that have kept you up at night?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that any kept me up, because it's a little bit different. Well, maybe not as different, but very often in public health, you can do an intervention without actually finding out what's causing it.
Right.
So, for instance, if there's an outbreak of diarrhea in a daycare, and there's a number of cases, you've got to close that daycare. You don't know what the agent is yet. Maybe you'll find it out, maybe you won't. The same thing with a foodborne illness. You might have a bunch of people who got sick at a restaurant, and they all ate at the same day and time, or maybe even had the same meal. You'll try to get samples from the patients and sample. What if all the food is gone, if it was a wedding or so? So you may not find the agent, but you can do a control effort. So we're used to a lot of crimes, so to speak, going unsolved.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that any of those that we didn't solve keep me up at night. Certainly, who mailed those anthrax letters is a question. They seem to have concluded that Bruce Ivins did it. He committed suicide. He was a researcher at a lab, an Army lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. But I'm not convinced that he did it. But that doesn't keep me up. What keeps me up at night is the future. The fact that public health is not being funded, not being respected, that the powers are being removed by states because they don't want restrictions of freedom. And it's going to be a balance no matter what. A lot of things that happened in COVID were to protect the vulnerable, and maybe that's really where things should have focused instead of kicking kids out of school. We had a lot of arguments in the health department of what we were doing, but again, the politicians were in control. It was pretty clear soon that kids weren't the vehicle being transmitted. They weren't the ones who were getting seriously ill. It was the elderly and those in nursing homes, and that's where we need to focus all efforts to protect those individuals from bad outcomes.
Right.
But it's the future that really worries me.
While the foundational principles of outbreak investigations have endured, the most transformative evolution has been in the lab. Decades ago, comparing bacterial isolates was crude, like identifying a criminal based on 6 foot, wearing a hat, a sweatshirt, and red sneakers. Today, whole genome sequencing allows for precise bacterial fingerprinting, enabling epidemiologists to link seemingly disparate cases with unparalleled certainty. Yet despite this scientific leap, Dr. Weiss voices a profound concern: the future of public health itself. He points to a critical triad of threats: severe lack of funding, pervasive disrespect for the field, and the erosion of public health powers by states. This often translates into political interference, where decisions become optics-driven rather than data-driven. The irony is stark. As the tools for detection become more powerful, the systems meant to wield them face unprecedented challenges, leaving dedicated public health servants fighting not just diseases, but for the very right to do their jobs effectively.
For someone reading Disease Detectives, your book, what should these stories teach them about the complexity and importance of epidemiological work?
Well, I hope they recognize that the individuals that are working in public health have the public's best interest at heart. These aren't power-hungry people. Most of them are very quiet, unassuming, work hard at their desks, and that this is operating on the background, and you don't really know what's going on because we're learning about diseases and trying to prevent them. It's only when outbreaks happen, and usually it's the CDC that gets the press. There's a lot of people who are working, civil servants who are being under attack. These are civil servants that are working hard to keep the public safe.
Amazing. Thank you. And is there anything else that you wanted to kind of mention or say before we wrap up here, Don?
Well, yeah, so this all wasn't work. We had a lot of fun at the health department.
Yeah.
We used to sponsor something called Take Your Children to Work Day,
Yeah.
where the parents were out the health department with their kids, and we usually have 50 or 60 of them. And we would do this game called the outbreak investigation, a mock outbreak, where the kids would actually do an investigation. Sometimes it was foodborne, once it was a Legionella, we did a tick-borne investigation. And it would be more like what's that called? A treasure hunt,
Yeah.
where we would hide ticks all throughout the department. The kids have to find them and bring them to the lab, and then we would do some fake lab testing to see whether they had Lyme disease or not. That was always a fun time. And in the holidays, we always would have this huge smorgasbord that would stretch one whole length of the floor, which is probably, I don't know, 60 or so feet, with all these chafing dishes. Because our staff were from all over the world, and people would bring dishes from their home countries, and so that was quite a thing.
Wow, yeah, no, it sounds like a really fun time. And yeah, of course, as much as we do great work in public health, there are obviously these human moments and these interactions and engagement with the community with a lot of the things that we do. And to your point there about worrying about the future of public health, I try to be as optimistic as possible despite a lot of the news that's going on. But I feel like those initiatives, such as the ones you mentioned about creating this treasure hunt and getting the younger generation interested in public health and kind of the science behind it, can go forward, and we can help build our capacity as public health professionals and build interest in the field to build that support to ultimately do what we want to do in public health, which is create healthier conditions in the communities and help keep people healthy. So I appreciate you being here, Don, and appreciate the great work you've done. And it's truly inspiring for me as well, because there comes a time in everyone's career where they have to make very big decisions. And like I mentioned early on, some of those decisions, there's risks attributed to them. And you really, as a public health professionals, need to consider the public, the population, your own values, your morals, and these ethical principles that you're building up in support of public health practice to make a decision that's best for the community. And I think you've exemplified that, and I think you've lived those values, and for that I appreciate. And I strongly recommend everyone to check out this book with so much insight and details that really inspired me as a public health professional who's not directly in epidemiology but benefits from the work that epidemiologists do. So thank you, Don, and please check out his book.
Thank you.
Amazing.
As we conclude the mini-series with Dr. Don Weiss, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Disease detectives are the unsung heroes of our communities, working tirelessly behind the scenes as meticulous investigators and dedicated civil servants. From tracking weaponized anthrax to hunting down invisible bacterial serial killers, their work, increasingly empowered by scientific advancements, faces continuous challenges from funding shortfalls, political resistance, and the sheer adaptability of these pathogens. This series underscores the critical importance of a robust, respected, and well-resourced public health system, because ultimately, the safety and health of our communities rests on the vigilance and unwavering dedication of these extraordinary individuals, whose success isn't just about stopping a disease, it's about safeguarding the very fabric of our daily lives. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music, from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art designed for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.